Welcome to the Thrive and Shine podcast. This is episode 5, and my guest today is Dr. William Neace. So, we're going to be talking about consciousness and free will. Dr. Neace is a doctor of psychology, so we might be hinging more towards philosophy, but I think it's kind of nice that we both don't have any expertise in that area, so we can have more opinions that aren't factually based. Getting right into it, what do you think is the meaning of life? No, I'm kidding.
You know, I'm often asked that question, and my answer is always whatever you want it to be.
Yeah, I was very briefly thinking about this, and I was feeling like if you ever did find the meaning of life, I don't know if life would have meaning after that.
Oh,
Because if you found the meaning, then what?
yeah, it would be anticlimactic, wouldn't it? I mean, why?
Yeah.
If you look at it from an existential perspective, and I kind of like
hmm
existential philosophy. If you look at it
hmm
from that perspective, what is life? Life is a search for meaning, and meaning in a very subjective, personal way. So the meaning of my life isn't going to be the same, for example, as the meaning of your life.
Yeah.
We have different experiences, we have different expectations. I'm 62 years old. Meaning for me has changed, during the course of my
hmm
lifetime. You're still a young guy with a lot of years ahead of you,
Yeah.
and experiences you've yet to have, which will all ultimately have an impact on your past and your present views of what meaning means to you and what your life means to you, and how you might direct that in the future.
Yeah. I know you hedge more towards determinism, but what stops you from going all the way to like nihilism?
Yeah, who says I stopped?
It's a good point.
I've I've actually argued that with a friend of mine. Uh,
hmm
uh, Nihilism and what is nihilism, and there are times, darker times, where I
hmm
do hedge into the nihilistic area. Uh, but determinism, I'm trained as an experimental empirical scientist. So, my background is experimental cognitive psychology, which is the study of how the mind works and how the brain gives rise to cognitive processes like thinking, reasoning, memory, and all that sorts of things. So my
hmm
bent is scientific. Um, and as a scientist, I have to believe that life isn't random and that natural processes aren't random. If they
hmm
were, we'd never be able to theorize about them. We'd never be able to derive hypotheses and test those hypotheses because we'd never get an idea of what precursors of an outcome are, and
hmm
and to create experiments to test and manipulate and see if we can change or create those outcomes. So part of me, a large part of my philosophy in scientific thinking is determinism, but that doesn't necessarily say that every outcome has a preceding cause. So
hmm
so we could have a set of causes which are linked to sets of outcomes in a probabilistic way. And what I mean by that, you could call what I'm talking about maybe probabilistic determinism.
hmm
So, for example, there's not a one-to-one correspondence between a particular cause and a particular effect.
hmm
Multiple causes which result in multiple effects, and at any given time, we have choices as to how we deal with these outcomes.
hmm
So,
Yeah.
it,
I think I lean more towards like a libertarian free will. How some you might have free will for some things, but not for all things. Um, you could put your hand on a hot stove and you can, as a reflex, you can take your hand off, but you could condition yourself to keep your hand on, which, you might, I think depends on the situation, how you are conditioned, how your environment is, and all these multiple factors that bring things together, where you might have free will for this, not as much for this. And it could boil down to like level of consciousness. Like if you're put into a void of nothing, this kind of goes into like another segue of questions I have is if it's possible to have an original thought. And my thinking is in today's world, no. Like if you put your body in a void and restrict all of your memories, no thoughts, no memories of anything previous, I don't think you could create a thought. If you have nothing to base anything off of, how could you produce an idea of anything? If there's nothing, no context of anything, no previously learned information. So I think consciousness is a huge basis.
Yeah, I agree. What makes us who we are as individuals is largely a very complicated interplay of factors like past experiences, biological makeup,
Hmm.
culture. Culture gives us perspective. Perspective limits what we're willing to accept, right?
Hmm.
And so you've got cultural influences, you've got experiential influences, and all of those together create who we are. So my perspective on looking at, for example, consciousness and originality is going to be
Hmm.
different from somebody else's perspective because of my training, my background, my experiences. But in terms of originality, it really depends on what you define as original. Is anything
Hmm.
truly original? You know, uh,
Yeah.
when the Flintstones created the wheel,
I was just about to bring this analogy up.
yeah, when the Flintstones created the wheel, was that an original thing? Didn't this circular thing exist in nature? And
Hmm.
wasn't it just kind
They
of,
saw a rock roll down a hill.
yeah, you see a rock roll down a hill and you get the idea that maybe if you attach that to something, you can roll
Hmm.
that something. And so pure originality, I don't think exists. But what does exist, I think, is our ability to synthesize existing ideas into different things.
Hmm.
If that makes
Hmm.
any sense.
Yeah, it does. I I've been going through a debate of myself of whether there is free will or not free will, and there's arguments for both sides. Um, I think some arguments for that there is free will is partly like cop outs, where you could say you bring in like moral responsibility, and that's a whole nother debate of how that ties into having free will.
William James,
But I
right?
think,
William James, moral responsibility.
yeah. But I feel like if you can't have original thought, then you wouldn't have free will because you have a a cause that leads to an effect, which is the basis of having no free will is like there's a cause that leads to this effect based on how your mood was this morning, leads to your appetite, leads to I'm going to have this for lunch, based on habits and environment, how you were brought up. It all leads to today in my life and whatever day today is that at 4 o'clock p.m. I'm going to have chicken and rice, and I'll lead up to this exact moment that this is the meal I'm going to have. Um, but uh, thinking back, I was thinking about the ship of Theseus. Are you familiar with this analogy or the thought experiment?
I'm not,
So the ship of
enlighten me.
so the ship of Theseus is, say you're a captain of a ship and you get to a point where you've had the ship for a long time. You need to replace one or two of the wooden planks. So you replace them, still the original ship. So you ask someone like, is it still the original ship? You replaced one or two things. Is it still original? And you might say, sure, it's still the original ship. It's only one or two things replaced. It's still the basis of the original thing. So then, you've had for longer, and then now you need to replace, let's say, 50% of the ship. Is it still the same ship? Then you might get to a whole point where you have to replace all of the wood from the ship, the original ship, but you saved all of the replaced wood. So now you have this first ship that's been replaced with everything, and you build a second ship with all of the original wood. Which ship is the original ship?
Yes.
Yeah. So Because I was asking my fiance about this today, and she's like, "Well, the replaced one's the original one has like the embodiment. You know, it's been through the journeys. That's the one." So then I was like proposing like, okay, if it was me, you know, I replaced my leg, I'd say I'm still me. I lost a leg, but I have a robotic leg. I'm still me. So then, okay, you know, you replace my arms, my legs. I would still think I'm me, even if I get a heart transplant. But then, like at one point, like when do I not become me? If I like, you know, created a body out of my old self, which one is more of me? Even if I had my consciousness in the original body, but I don't in the one that's looks like me, talks like me, everything is that would be Jordan. But then the replaced one doesn't look like me. But to me, I guess I would feel like me in the replaced one, which I guess would bring you to dualism, like Rene Descartes, mind and body, which is, you know, if you think your mind and body are two separate things, or you think it's one.
Yeah, ships are ships. They don't have hearts, they don't have souls, they don't have intentionality, and they don't have
Hmm.
self-awareness, right? So,
Yeah.
if we took a ship and we replaced it with new wooden parts, but we still kept the same design, you know,
Hmm.
is it the same? Is it the same ship? No.
Hmm.
Is it a ship based on the same design? Yeah. And you have to maintenance those things, right? You go through cellular degeneration all of the time. Your
Yeah.
body's constantly replacing cells. Does that mean that's you're not you? And for me, as when you
Hmm.
think about human beings, what that hinges on, and we mentioned consciousness a couple of times, but what makes you you? And what makes me
Hmm.
me? And how do you distinguish between you and me? And my answer to
Yeah.
that is you have your own subjective point of view, and
Hmm.
your brain creates for you your representation of reality that is unique to Jordan. My
Yeah.
brain, for me, creates my own unique representation of reality that's unique to Bill. And most of the time, you and I can agree on what reality is. Right now, I'm sitting in a room, you're sitting in a room. We agree we're sitting in rooms and the rooms are real.
Hmm.
But sometimes those realities diverge because the way that your mind creates your perceptions can differ based upon your experience. In my mind, here's some modern mind experiments for you. Is the damn
Hmm.
dress white and gold, or is it black and blue? You know,
Yes.
what color is the dress? And you show the same picture to two different people.
Hmm.
One sees the lighter colored dress, one sees the darker colored dress. And it seems like a mystery until you understand how the brain is taking incomplete perceptual information and then constructing an image for you to perceive. So it all starts with raw sensory input, right? And it
Hmm.
ends up being put together and constructed in a way that your brain makes sense of it. And research on that particular phenomenon is kind of interesting. It says that if you're looking at the picture, and generally we know that light comes from above, right? Light sources generally come from above and wash down on us. So
Hmm.
if your brain makes the assumption that that dress is being lit by like overhead lights or sunlight, then it's going to compute a lighter image for you. On the other hand, there is some slight suggestion on the bottom of that picture that there's a light source there, like runway lights.
Hmm. Yeah.
And some people's brains pick up on that light source not being from above, but being from the ground up. And it's that perception that creates the darker image of the picture for people. It's objectively the same picture, but people's brains construct the perception differently.
Hmm.
And visual illusions are fascinating. Is it a duck or is it a rabbit? Is it a bee or is it a 13? I mean, these are some classical,
Yeah.
perceptions that all suggest the most important thing that allows your brain to create your world for you is context and how that context is interpreted.
That's all visual. So how would you go about explaining the was it Green Arrow and Brainstorm, the auditory one, where you hear
Oh,
either brainstorm or you hear Green Arrow?
yeah, 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 yeah.
So what's different that's going on in that
Eh,
versus a visual thing?
Yeah, it's the same basic mechanism as context
Hmm.
and people's experiences. So when you're listening, I mean, we all learn to listen experientially. No one can sit down and teach you how to listen, right? You're born with a
Hmm.
particular hardware design that allows you to take. And what is hearing anyway? It's just sound. It's just waves of molecules
Yeah.
hitting your outer ear, and then
And
yeah, it's
vibrating.
generating
Yeah.
a neurological signal that gets sent to the brain's auditory center, and then it's constructed there. Different experiences will lead to different constructions of the same objective stimulus.
Hmm. If you could relate this to free will, because I'm thinking like back to decisions, how well there's like I'm gonna try to relate this best I can. There's a study in I think the 80s. I can't remember what the exact study was called, but they were measuring brain activity, and they would have participants do something, and this is where they saw your brain was consciously doing
Ben
something
Libet,
before you were, or
yeah,
yeah,
Benjamin Libet. Mhm.
yeah, the libet. So you weren't consciously aware you're doing it until like after you did it. But I also saw that they were also able to cancel what they're doing while they're doing it. So there's a point where like they could elicit the behavior, they either do the behavior and they're not consciously aware of it until afterwards. But there was also abilities where they could cancel the behavior before it happens. Um, so going with what we're talking about with like decisions with what we can hear, kind of relating to free will, is how can you choose to hear both things in a sense? Because there's people that can see both the both colors of the dress. They can hear both things. They can see the ballerina spinning both directions. Um, is
Only,
this any way?
but they can only do that one frame at a time. They cannot simultaneously see both colors of the dress. They cannot simultaneously hear both of the auditory stimuli,
Uh,
and they can't
hmm.
they can't simultaneously. What was the other thing he said?
The spinning
Oh, the
ballerina.
ballerina. They can't simultaneously see both images.
Yeah.
What
Okay.
they can do is they can train themselves based on experience who see those two things, but not simultaneously. So again, it's experience and how your brain interprets that experience, right? When
Hmm.
you talk about Leibniz experiments, Leibniz says, look, your brain about what? About half a millisecond or 500, yeah, about 500, so half a second, about 500 milliseconds before you
Hmm.
decide to take an action, your brain's already decided you're going to take that action. So where does that leave free will? But you can also choose to act or not to act.
Hmm.
And so, whereas a lower order animal doesn't have that choice to act or not to act, human beings do. So, if you think about it, you can call it um, what can you call it? You could call it choice of response, right? And therein lies
Hmm.
free will. We have a choice. Okay, so you and I both exercise. We value exercise. We value nutrition, right?
Hmm.
Well, what determined that? We weren't born wanting to be bodybuilders, right? Nobody's a born
Hmm.
bodybuilder. What happens is we accrue experience over time, And that experience allows us to make choices. What's deterministic about that is my genetics. There ain't no way I'm ever going to be Ronnie
Hmm.
Coleman without an extensive set of chemical supports.
Hmm.
But at the same time, I can choose a healthier lifestyle. And I'll share this with you and your viewers on a personal note. When I was a kid, I was obese. I was 200 pounds when I was in eighth grade. I was in a size 36 male pants when I was I'm sorry, eighth grade. I was 200 pounds in eighth grade. Got bullied, got made fun of, you know. What changed? Well, what changed was, my genes might have determined that and my experiences, right? I had some very interesting experiences with nutrition as a child. I was born sickly, and then when I started to grow, my mother
Hmm.
and grandmother just fed me everything I would eat because I was a little puny kid, and
Hmm.
unfortunately created a situation for me. But later on, I had choices. I could continue to eat that way, and I could continue to live that lifestyle. But at some point, there came along a choice I had to make. And the choice was in response to wanting to interact more positively with my peers in high school, right? And how do you do that? Well, you begin making choices. So my nutrition and exercise regimen wasn't determined. It was a choice I made. And then that choice I made became deterministic in what things I allowed myself to eat, what things I allowed myself to do. Does that make sense?
Hmm. Do you think you lean more towards libertarian free will than determinism? That you have free will for some things and not for others?
I would go back to my poor attempt at talking about probabilistic determinism because life
Hmm.
is going to give you a set of choices, right?
Hmm.
And that's kind of the determinist part. You don't get to set your environment. Life does for you. But when you're
Hmm.
faced with that, then you can because you're a human being uniquely, because your brain has developed to the point where you have extensively developed frontal lobes, you can evaluate and think. Whereas lower order animals can't because their brains aren't developed to that extent. So the you have an ability to evaluate the information which is presented to you and then make a choice. And
Hmm.
it's in making that choice that you're exercising some form of free will. But even still, the choices that you make are limited by your past experiences, your
Hmm.
future expectations, and your cultural values, your social values,
Hmm.
those sorts of things. So a lot of the choices that we make, I would argue that we feel like we have control over the outcomes and the choices that we make,
Hmm.
but we're not really given full and unconditional ability to create our own set of choices.
So you think that to an extent we have free will?
Yes,
When you would say that animals do not have free will?
by and large, there are some animals. Well, let's say, what is free will? If we define free will as our ability,
Yeah.
yeah, if we define free will as our ability to consider,
Really make any chores?
yeah, to think, to evaluate, um, then I'd say that there are many lower order animals that don't have that level of free will. I wouldn't say they don't have any free will, right?
Hmm.
But I don't think they have the level of free will that we have because of the development of our brain. And in particular, I'm talking about the
Hmm.
frontal lobe area. I'm talking about if you talk about short-term memory, I'm talking about executive function.
Yeah.
Um, and so but are they completely deterministic? They have the limited choices to make, right? Sometimes your
Hmm.
cat wants to come and rub up against you. And sometimes when you go pet your cat, she scratches you. You know, what's up with
Hmm.
that? She's making choices. You know, what are the basis of her choices? I have no idea because I can't possibly understand what a cat's consciousness is. As much as I would like
Yeah.
to try, I can't. You know, I can't do it.
I guess this goes more towards behavioral psychology, but to this extent, I would agree that like we have more free will than animals do. So, assuming the same thing, I think that there's some animals that are more intelligent than a newborn baby.
Oh yeah,
Like,
I think there's some animals
yeah.
that are intelligent, and more intelligent than people I have to deal with.
So then, for like behavioral um, or developmental psychology, sorry, at what point would a newborn baby come to have the same level of free will that we do? If they don't have the same amount as we do as when they're a baby, because obviously they have more limited choices of what they can do. They can roll over and cry and poop.
And all
Um,
those, I would
so what?
argue, are instincts, right? Those we're talking
Yeah.
about a newborn baby operates instinctually, just as a lower order
Hmm.
animal, you know, an adult lower order animal might in some species.
Hmm.
You know, mice, rats, things with very small brains. A baby's got a
Yeah.
little, a baby's got a big brain, but nothing's connected, right?
Hmm.
Nothing's connected.
Yeah.
You know, and so
There's a comedian that did a funny thing about this. How there's you have to be with the baby like every day, 24/7, feed it, wipe its butt, all this stuff. But then a newborn baby deer is born and it's like, where are the berries? I'm gonna go find the berries. Where's mom? I'm gonna go walk around, search the forest, and it's like already doing things right out of the womb. Versus the babies that we have just kind of sit there and wait to be fed and taken care of.
yeah, the more complex the animal, the longer its dependency on its caregivers. You
Hmm.
know, chimps have a longer period of needing help from their caregivers than mice do. You know, well,
Yeah.
chimps are much more complicated. Their brains are bigger, and what they can do far exceeds what a mouse can do. You know,
Hmm.
same with humans. I mean, when a baby's first born, it's largely operating out of instinct. You know, it cries when it's hungry, it cries when it wants to play. You know, the only way it can communicate is very limited. And then it grows up like us and we're communicating in very complex ways.
Hmm.
What happens? Well, I mean, I'm a cognitive psychologist, right? You know, if I were a carpenter, I'd see everything was a nail. I mean, it's the development of the brain and the neural connections that are
Hmm.
formed largely through experience with the environment. And as those neural
Hmm.
connections are formed, thinking becomes more complex, and uh, consciousness and free will come online much later for
Hmm.
us. Um, in fact, you know, I mean, the human brain is not fully developed in the frontal lobe area until your mid 20s. It
Hmm.
takes a long time for your brain to develop. But I don't know if I'm even addressing the question anymore. What point does it?
I think we're talking about, yeah,
So
because I know we're talking about intelligence and all that. And I think, isn't it true that it's not the size of the brain, but it's the density of neurons? Is
largely,
that right?
yeah, it's
Yeah.
not an either or. It's not that false dichotomy because it's
Hmm.
the density of the neurons that creates size, right? And the
Yeah.
more dense the neurons are, that's why your brain's got all these folds in it. There are billions of neurons. If we laid your brain out, it would cover a state,
Hmm.
you know? Well, it's
Yeah.
got to fold in on itself to fit in the cranium, which, of course, this is determinism, right? We got this from somewhere. We didn't create it.
Yeah.
But it's the number of neural connections that is possible for your brain to make. And the human brain is one of those brains that, you know, because a whale has a much larger brain than a human being does, but you don't
Hmm.
see it, you know, developing SpaceX rockets and stuff like that, right? So, so
That'd be terrifying.
it would be if a whale came out of the water and said, you know what? It's my time.
Going a little bit more towards the religious side, I have another interesting thought experiment that I've heard a couple
Yeah,
times.
sure.
Is say you're walking on the beach and you find a watch. But you'd assume that the watch has a creator, and not that it just over time, over thousands of years, pieces of sand and minerals somehow came and formed in the right time and right formation and just magically formed this working watch. Um, so I think it kind of relates to, creation of universe, everything, that there has to be some kind of creator that you wouldn't see something that's, you've probably heard the term that our Earth was created on a knife edge. If, things have been, a degree different, then it would be unstable and we wouldn't have life. So you think that with something on a knife edge and so specific that we have this life and it's flourishing and, it's a livable habitat, that there must be a creator or something so specifically working and functioning as it is. I would say much more complex than a watch that you would, find on a beach, and you would assume that, there's a creator of the watch, not just the watch appeared and happened over 1,000 years. Um, what do you kind of think about like that idea of, there being a creator to the watch, to say?
I've always been fascinated. Here's a question I have for you, Jordan.
Yeah.
Why do human beings who have this level of autonomy and who have done great things and terrible things, we've done them both
Hmm.
as a species, right? We've done great things, we've done terrible things. But why is it that we need to believe that there's something greater than us?
A great question.
I mean, I've always been fascinated. I'll give you a little background. I grew up Roman Catholic. My mother was Italian, so I
Hmm.
grew up very staunchly Roman Catholic. Went to Catholic schools most of my life until I hit college. I went to the
Hmm.
University of Maryland at College Park, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, you can cut that out. Um, but I was raised staunchly Catholic. Uh, Went to church. You know, the all of the religious tenets that is Catholicism. I studied. I lived. I believed for the longest time.
Hmm.
And then one day I just stopped, and I was a junior in college. I was a junior at the University of Maryland, and one day I just asked myself, why? Why do we need
Yeah. I.
this? What is the purpose of this? Is the purpose of this so I don't have anxiety? Is the purpose of this so I can give my life some meaning?
Hmm.
Does this belief in this creator give my life meaning? I don't have any other way of developing meaning for my life. So I went through a lot of questions and a lot of issues, and what fell out of it is secular humanism. So I would describe myself today as a believing in secular humanism. I respect other people,
Yeah.
take care of them. I'd rush into burning buildings to save babies, but not because
Hmm.
of a creator.
Hmm.
'Cause
Yeah. Uh, Answering both questions, I think people are just innately good. Not that there's, kind of relating to moral responsibility, but there's a philosopher that said this: that there's four different things that you could believe in God, follow His rules. If He is real, you go to heaven. If He's not real, no harm, no foul. If you don't believe and He's not real, no harm, no foul. And if you don't believe and He is real, then you go to hell. And he said, like, I'd rather bet my cards on that He is right, because then everything works out well. And then I think just it's a funny idea that I think, assuming that God is real, He would say, well, you bet your cards in the right place. Like, that's not really believing. Um, but I think it is really fascinating to me as well. Like, one thing I think about a lot is why people believe specifically in God. That if I were to be put in India, or if I were to be put in China, I would be most likely Buddhist, or I'd be, what other Hindi or whatever their religion would be, and they would purely be determined based on where I was born, and the fact that I was born, in a religious area of Kentucky, Bible Belt. There's a very high percentage that I would be, Catholic, Methodist, Baptist, whatever it is, and I think it's so fascinating to me because I think about like the really religious friends that I have, and I think like I really don't think that they would be Christian had I put them in like India or wherever else there's a very common religion that's not Catholicism or Christianity. And I don't know if I'm convinced that they would find their way back to Christianity and if that would actually follow through to be true. I don't know if that would be the case. And I think that to an extent they might even agree.
If I were born in India and I were raised to be Buddhist, for example,
Hmm.
why would I? Why would I seek out a different religion,
Hmm.
or want a different religious experience or religious belief when mine is the one that I've known all my life and I aspire to? And is it Nirvana? Is that Buddhist?
I can remember.
Me neither. Anyway, so I mean, in a class that I used to teach. I don't teach it anymore, but in a class I used to teach, history and issues of psychology. I had a book called "The 10 Philosophies of Human Nature," and it was an outline of 10 major philosophies: Buddhism, Catholicism, several others. There was what's the Chinese?
Indy.
Hindi. Uh,
Um,
uh, I can't remember all of them. I couldn't name them all. Marxism was in there. That's a philosophy.
hmm
Um, and when you look at that and you step back, and I used to have students write a paper, outline these philosophies, now come up with the 11th one. And generally, what students would do is they would take bits and pieces of these other philosophies, the things that they liked, they would try and put together, and the things they
hmm
disliked, they would discard.
hmm
What does that suggest? That suggests to me that there is no one true correct. There's no big truth with a capital T in terms of philosophy, but
hmm
there is value in the way people think about their own personal existence and what their purpose is on this planet.
Do you think if hypothetically religion didn't exist, do you think that we as humans, as people, would have the same moral values?
Well, that question answered itself, didn't it? Like, from where do you derive moral values if not from some form of
Yeah,
religion, right?
I guess it would be that people like are innately good, and I think it would kind of derive from I guess like an animalistic perspective that like wolves have a pack, they take care of each other's pack. They don't believe in a Buddhist god. They just they're taking after each other, and I think innately they want the best for their tribe.
Yeah.
I think that would be innate good.
Yeah.
Um, so that's kind of where like my philosophy of that is deriving from, is that from like an animal perspective where like they're not consciously, oh, I'm going to help this other wolf accomplish this task. They're doing it out of innate good for the success of their tribe thriving, whatever it is. I think it's essentially kind of the same thing. I think even if religion wasn't a thing that didn't come to exist, that I think people are innately still good or want the best for their surrounding pack, so to speak.
Yeah, I would agree with that because, if you think about it at the core, we are all animals. Now, other people might
Hmm.
disagree and they think that human beings are categorically different from the animal kingdom, but I don't. And as such, we have all of those values that the lower order animal might have. Um, so if there weren't a religion, will we still look out for each other? Will we still have families? Would we still procreate? Will we still take care of our children and want the best for our children and
Hmm.
put them in positions where they better themselves and have a better life? Yeah, we would do all of that stuff, perhaps
Hmm.
for different reasons.
Yeah. So I don't know. There's a lot of those things like that I've been thinking about. Like if you were to come down to like core beliefs of just human existence, like us being innately good, um, it's hard to say that or it's hard to I guess accept that it does debunk some religions and saying that things like that and moral beliefs. And like I was saying earlier, like I think my friends that are really religious would have a hard time accepting that their religion is being boiled down to just being, animalistic or innately good creatures.
Yeah, of course, it's a personal affront to their beliefs. You know,
Hmm.
um, I've dealt with many different people, many different cultures. You know, and what I see overall is the tendency for people to be good. At their very core, the tendency is to be good. Aside from a few people, you're just going to walk out. Well, it even begs the question of this: why are some people inherently not good? And is it because they don't believe in religion? For example, sociopaths or psychopaths have absolutely no moral compass at all.
Hmm.
And from an evolutionary perspective, we might say these people are perfect because all they do is maximize personal gain.
Hmm.
They're like sharks, right? Sharks,
Yeah.
what do sharks do? They swim and they eat and they make baby sharks, and that's all they do, right? They are perfect
Hmm.
machines in the ocean. That's all they do. That's what psychopaths do. For someone like you
Yeah.
and me or your friends, we might say, well, that's morally reprehensible to act that way. And they have no regard for the welfare of other people and just to use people and then discard them or allow them to be hurt or even hurt them if you have to.
And you say why?
Yeah. What makes them do why? Is it the lack of if it were just the lack of religious belief, then they would still have that core good
Hmm.
component, but they don't. And some of the
Hmm.
answer to that question is, well, I'm a cognitive psychologist. If I were a carpenter, everything's a nail. Uh, Brain development in people who are have antisocial personality disorder is actually different than brain development for someone who does not have antisocial personality disorder, and a lot of it is in um, areas that are related to empathy. So
Hmm.
folks who are antisocial personality who have been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder don't have the empathy that you and I have. And without that
Hmm.
empathy, I don't think you get that good core. Because I think that's what you and I are really talking about. We have empathy for someone else. And so we're going to protect our tribe. We're going to protect our family. Why? Because we have empathy for them and we have care and concern for them.
Hmm.
And you take that component away from a neurological perspective, then you lose your ability to have that good guiding core that we're talking about.
Hmm. Yeah. Adding to what you said, you mentioned uh, there's people that aren't religious that do terrible things. And there's also people that I would say are religious that also do terrible things.
Yeah.
There's people that aren't religious that do amazing things. And you get like a whole spectrum. So there's, I guess, not as much consistency. Because I know people that aren't religious that are amazing people. I know people that are religious that are not so great people. And, you have a whole spectrum of everything. Um, I think that a lot of it kind of does come down to, like you were saying earlier, like people are either going to maximize personal gain, whether it's for innate good for themselves or for their tribe if they have one. If they have a sense of community, they're probably going to delegate more to like innate goodness. But if they're, I guess, more isolated, then they probably won't. And they'll probably, maximize their personal gain as much as they can in whatever subjective means that is.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
Um, yeah, and I was gonna say because you mentioned going from like cognitive disorders. Do you think, going back to free will, if someone's bipolar, that they would not have free will because they're not as in control of which personality will be like running the ship?
No, I would say that the reason, if they had full free will, if we had full capacity of free will, nobody'd be depressed, nobody'd be anxious, nobody'd be bipolar.
Hmm.
We have the limitations I was talking about, right? One of those limitations was
Yeah.
biological limitation. And because of the brain chemistry in someone who is diagnosed with bipolar disorder or someone who's diagnosed with depression or anxiety, because of the brain chemistry differences, that's their precursor. That's what gives them their set of choices that they get.
Hmm.
Same argument you could make with an alcoholic, right? There comes a certain point where someone becomes addicted to a substance. Now,
Yeah.
you want to talk about free will? Where does free will go? No one chooses to be desolate in the street, an alcoholic or a drug addict, right? What
Hmm.
happens is their capacity to choose goes away with addiction.
It's like if someone's on drugs and they commit a crime, was it the drugs that did that, or was it them that's acting upon being on drugs?
And if you believe free
Yeah.
will, if you believe in the strong form of free will, then you punish them.
Hmm.
But if you believe in the form of free will that has to do with capacity to make decisions and make choices, then you mitigate that punishment because you know that they weren't in full control of their faculties. And why? Because they were addicted to a substance. And because of that, they diminish their capacity to make choices and to reason and to think about what they're doing.
Interesting question for you. Do you think it'd be better to have a judge that ruled with free will, or assuming there was no free will?
I you know, a judge has a lot of responsibility for dealing with cases, and I assume we're going to talk about a criminal case, right?
I was just kind of opening the question.
So in general, uh,
Yeah.
well, if I'm in a corporate situation, I'd like to have a judge rule with intentionality, right? So
Hmm.
they're going to base cases based on the plaintiff and the defendant being intentional in their actions, and that's the basis. I'm going to assume you have free will and you are intentional in what you did, and I'm going to judge accordingly. If I were in a different context, say I'm in a criminal court and somebody who's a drug addict commits a crime, then I'm gonna want that judge to understand that intentionality may not have been there, and I would like the judge to consider more of what can we do with it for this individual to get them out of the situation they're in,
Hmm.
and I would want a judge that's not strong on free will but high on understanding that this person may not have actually had the free will and the capacity they needed to
Hmm.
make the decisions that they made. So, so
Yeah. Yeah.
for me, it's context dependent.
Yeah. I think I agree with that for the most extent. That I think it would be hard. I think it'd be as hard to have impartial to both sides of, ruling with both sides of being more having a, free will basis of moral responsibility, or having, the other end of it. And I guess it would really be context dependent on like a criminal case versus more of a civil case or whatever it is. Yeah. But I think that we've really covered the majority of the questions I have. I think we can kind of wrap it up here. I really appreciate you coming on to the show.
Hey, listen, I appreciate the invitation. I was glad to hear from you. I know you're a former student of mine. I'm very happy to see that you're doing well for yourself, and we've discussed some things. I'm wishing you the very best for your future, and I appreciate you letting me come on and yap about stuff with you.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Well, thank you for having us. If you guys made it this far to episode 5, then appreciate you guys listening. Thank you.